Was standing on my son's front porch with a casserole dish in my hands, the chicken and wild rice one he used to ask for every winter, when his wife opened the door, looked straight through me and said, "We didn't invite you. Leave, or I'll call the police." I stood there for a moment, the dish still warm against my palms. Then I set it down carefully on the porch railing, walked back to my truck, and called my estate lawyer. That was November. By March, they'd lost the house. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I'm not a vindictive man. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the province of Ontario, designing drainage systems and bridge supports and the kind of infrastructure nobody thinks about until it fails. My whole career was about making sure things held up under pressure. I thought I'd applied that same principle to my family. Turns out I'd missed a crack in the foundation, and it had been spreading for years without me noticing. My son is named Philip. He's 36. He married a woman named Isabel 5 years ago, and somewhere in those 5 years, the boy who used to help me reshingle the garage roof became a stranger who let his wife speak to his father like I was a nuisance on her doorstep. The trouble started, as it often does, with money I never should have offered. 3 years ago, Philip and Isabel wanted to buy a house in Barrie. Nice area, close to the water, good schools for the children they kept talking about having. The problem was their finances were a mess. Philip had switched careers twice in 4 years, from IT sales to personal training to something involving digital marketing that he struggled to explain clearly. Isabel worked part-time at a dental office and spent the rest of her time on what she called her wellness brand, which, as far as I could tell, involved posting photographs of smoothies on Instagram. Together, they qualified for maybe $320,000. The house they wanted cost $495,000. I sat across from the mortgage specialist at TD Bank, a careful young woman named Ms. Park who laid out the numbers without judgment, and she explained that with a co-signer who had strong credit and verifiable pension income, the loan could work. Philip squeezed Isabel's hand. Isabel looked at me with an expression I now recognize as calculation dressed up as gratitude. I hesitated. The engineer in me was already identifying load-bearing problems. But Philip was my son, and I'd spent 30 years making sure he didn't have to struggle the way his mother and I had when we were young. His mother passed in 2014, breast cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, Philip was all I had left of the family we'd built together, and I was not ready to lose him too. So I signed. Miss Park was thorough. She walked through all the legal language, co-applicant rights, shared legal standing on the property, my right to be consulted on any major financial decisions regarding the home. Philip nodded quickly, the way he always nodded when he wanted to skip to the end. Isabel studied her manicure. I drove home too early that evening feeling cautious but hopeful. The hope lasted about 2 years. The first sign that something was wrong came from a phone call I almost didn't receive. A collections representative from a second-tier lender I'd never heard of left a voicemail on my landline. The number still listed as an alternate contact from the original mortgage paperwork. They were following up on missed payments for a $40,000 home equity line of credit secured against 14 Cartwright Lane, Barrie. Philip's address. I sat at my kitchen table and played the message 3 times. Then I called back, gave them enough information to confirm the account existed, and started making my own calls. It took me 2 days and some careful cross-referencing through Service Ontario's property records portal to piece together what had happened. Philip, or possibly Isabel, I still don't know whose idea it was, had taken out a home equity line of credit 18 months earlier, $40,000, secured against the house I co-signed for. Then there was a second loan, a personal line of credit with a different lender also tied to the property as collateral for another $22,000. I found traces of it through a credit monitoring service I'd subscribed to years ago, back when identity theft was in the news constantly. My name had pinged on a New Hard inquiry I hadn't authorized. In total, $62,000 in debt layered onto a property that already carried a $385,000 mortgage. In a market that had started cooling. In a house owned, legally, at least in part, by me. I drove to Barrie on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Philip was at work. I hadn't called ahead. Isabel answered the door in workout clothes, holding a protein shake, and her expression shifted through three emotions in about 2 seconds: surprise, irritation, and then something that settled into careful pleasantness. "Walter, this is unexpected. She'd always called me by my first name. I'd never asked her to. I need to talk to Philip. Tonight, if possible. It's about the house." Something tightened around her eyes. "What about the house?" "The loans, Isabel. The home equity line and the second credit facility. I found out about them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's our financial business. We're handling it. My name is on that property. As a co-signer, not as an owner." That wasn't legally accurate, and I knew it. But I didn't correct her at the door. I asked again for Philip to call me, said it was important, and drove back to Orlia. He called that evening. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. He told me the loans were for home improvements, some renovations Isabel had wanted, a new kitchen, a finished basement. He told me they were managing the payments. He told me I was overreacting. When I mentioned that I'd received a collections call, he went quiet, then said the payment had been delayed because of a banking error and it was already sorted. "Philip," I said, "I need to see the statements. All of them." "Dad." His voice had that tone I'd started noticing in the last few years, the one that meant he was deciding how much patience to extend to me. "We're adults. We manage our own finances." With my name on the title. "As a co-signer," he said again, exactly as Isabel had said it. I wondered if they'd rehearsed it. I tried once more. I asked to sit down with them together, go over the numbers, maybe talk to a financial advisor about a plan to pay down the equity line before it caused real damage. Philip said he'd think about it. He never called back. I drove to Barrie again 3 weeks later, this time with printed bank records I requested through the collections contact, plus the credit monitoring alerts I documented. I knocked on the door on a Saturday morning. I could see Isabel's car in the driveway and the blue flicker of the television through the front window. Philip opened the door. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Dad, what are you?" "I need 5 minutes. I have documents." I heard Isabel's voice from somewhere inside the house. "Who is it?" "My dad." A pause. "He has papers." She appeared behind him in the hallway, arms crossed. Her expression was the one I imagined she used with difficult clients at the dental office. Professionally cool. "Walter, we've already talked about this. You've told me it's handled. I haven't seen any evidence that it is. The collections calls suggest otherwise." "1 missed payment. 2 lenders, Isabel, $62,000. I held up the documents. "My name is on this property. I have a legal right to know what's been done with it as collateral." Philip stepped slightly in front of his wife, which I think he meant as a protective gesture. "Dad, you need to stop. You're making this into something it isn't. I'm trying to help you." "We don't need your help." His voice came out harder than I think he intended. "We're fine. We're adults. Stop showing up here like we're children who can't manage our own lives." "Philip." "I mean it, Dad," he exhaled. "If you come here again with papers and accusations, Isabel's going to call the police. We'll report it as harassment." I looked at my son. He didn't look away, but something in his face wasn't quite steady. "All right," I said. I folded the documents and put them back in my jacket. "I understand." I walked to my truck, sat in the driveway for a moment. Through the front window, I could see Philip and Isabel in what looked like an argument, though I couldn't hear anything. Then the curtain moved and neither of them was visible anymore. I started the engine and drove home. But I didn't drive home empty-handed. I drove home with clarity. That evening, I sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Philip had done his homework at the table while his mother made dinner, where we'd played cribbage on Friday nights, where we'd gotten the phone call about her diagnosis. And I thought about what I was actually dealing with. Not an irresponsible son who needed a father's guidance. Not a misunderstanding that a good conversation could fix. I was dealing with people who had used my legal standing as a financial resource without my knowledge, who had responded to my concern with threats, and who had, at some point, stopped seeing me as family and started seeing me as an obstacle. My late wife used to say, "You can't force someone to love you correctly, but you can decide what you're willing to accept." I pulled out the original mortgage documents from my home filing system. I've kept every major document organized in a 2-drawer cabinet in the spare bedroom since 1987. One folder per property, one folder per vehicle, everything dated and cross-referenced. The co-applicant language was exactly as Miss Park had described it. Joint and several liability, equal legal standing on major property decisions, the right to initiate protective proceedings in the event of financial distress. I read that last part twice. Then I called my lawyer. Not a family friend, a property and estate lawyer in Barrie named Mr. Fung, who'd been recommended to me years ago by a colleague at the province. I'd used him once before to update my will after Margaret passed. He was the kind of lawyer who spoke in complete sentences and never charged for time he didn't use. I explained the situation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked 2 questions. Was my name still on the title? And did I have documentation of the unauthorized lending? Yes to both. In Ontario, he said, a co-applicant on a mortgage has significant standing. The additional loans against the property, depending on how they were secured, may constitute a breach of your co-applicant rights if your consent wasn't obtained. At minimum, you have grounds for a partition action, forced sale proceeds divided according to ownership percentage. How long? 60 to 90 days if they don't contest, could extend if they do. And if I want to proceed, I'll need the mortgage documents, the title records, and anything you have on the additional loans. Can you have them to me by Friday? I had them to him by Wednesday. The filing happened on a Monday morning in December. I dressed in my Goodwool blazer, the gray one I'd bought for Margaret's memorial service, and met Mr. Fung at the Simcoe County Courthouse in Barrie. The clerk's office processed the paperwork with the same efficient attachment as every other piece of legal machinery I'd encountered in my life. Stamped. Filed. Assigned a case number. Petition for partition by sale. Applicant, Walter Dermot Cook. Respondents, Philip James Cook and Isabel Marie Cook. Service would be completed within 7 business days. I drove back to Orillia on the 400. Radio off, watching the November gray fields slide past the window. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just the quiet that comes after you've made a decision you know is right, even though it costs you something you can't get back. Philip called on a Thursday. I was in the middle of repairing the gate latch on my back fence. The cold had warped the wood and the mechanism kept sticking, and I let it ring. His voicemail was short and shaking. Dad, we got served today. Some sheriff came to the door. We don't understand what's happening. Please call me back. Isabel's message came 20 minutes later. Her voice was controlled but tight in the way of someone holding together something that wants to fall apart. Walter, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is our home. You cannot do this. We have rights here too. I called Mr. Fung instead, confirmed service had been completed, and went back to fixing the gate. Over the following 2 weeks, the calls came in waves. Philip oscillated between angry and pleading, sometimes within the same message. Isabel stayed cold, which I found easier to listen to than Philip's distress, which sat in my chest like a stone. My daughter-in-law called me manipulative, controlling, a man who couldn't accept that his son had grown up. My son called me the only family he had left and asked me how I could do this to him. I saved every voicemail and forwarded them to Mr. Fung. What I didn't do was call back, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what a callback would mean. Philip would cry. I would soften. Isabel would negotiate from that softened position, and in 6 months I'd be back at square one with $62,000 in loans I hadn't consented to and a son who'd learned the wrong lesson. The hardest night was a Wednesday in January when Philip left a message that lasted almost 4 minutes. He talked about his mother. He talked about being 12 years old and the 2 of us driving to her hospital appointments, how I'd always held his hand in the waiting room. He said, "I know I messed up, Dad. I know I let her down." I sat in my kitchen and played that message twice, and then I got up and made tea and stood at the window looking out at the snow on the back garden for a long time. But I didn't call back. They had 30 days to file a response to the petition. They didn't. Mr. Fung called on a Tuesday to let me know. No response filed. We proceed to default hearing. They didn't even contest it. Their instinct was probably that it would go away. that you'd back down. A pause. People often underestimate retired engineers. I hired a real estate agent to conduct a market analysis, a woman named Ms. Beauchamp who specialized in the Barry corridor and had sold 3 houses on Phillip Street in the past 18 months. She did the walkthrough while Phillip was at work. Isabel was home and apparently stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed for the entire visit without saying a single word. Ms. Beauchamp called me afterward. The property presents well. A few cosmetic items, nothing structural. I'd list at $514,000 in the current market. Expect offers around $523 to $5 to $35. And in a partition sale. Motivated seller pricing. You're likely looking at $490,000 to $505,000, still strong equity. I did the arithmetic on a notepad. $490,000 minus $385,000 in original mortgage, minus the $62,000 in unauthorized loans that would need to be discharged, minus legal fees and commission. My share of net proceeds based on the co-applicant ownership split came out to somewhere between $19,000 and $24,000. Not a fortune. But it wasn't about the money. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't about the money. It was about the moment Phillip said Isabel's going to call the police, as if a father showing up with documents was the threat in this situation, rather than $62,000 quietly leveraged against a home he'd helped build. The court-ordered appraisal came back at $512,000. The for-sale listing went live on a Friday. Mr. Fung sent me a copy of the MLS listing. Professional photos, clean staging, strong curb appeal. Isabel had good taste, I'll give her that. The house looked like a home that had been cared for, even if the finances behind it hadn't been. Phillip called 4 times that Friday. The voicemails escalated in a pattern I recognized by then: confusion, then anger, then calculation, then something that sounded like the old Phillip, the one I remembered. In the last message he said, "Dad, I know you're not going to answer. I've figured that out. But I need you to know I'm going to fix this. Not for the house. The house is probably gone. I can see that now. But I'm going to fix myself. I'm going to get the counseling Isabel doesn't think I need, and I'm going to figure out how I ended up here. I don't know if that matters to you anymore. I hope it does." I played that 3 times. Then I called Mr. Fung and asked if there was any legal mechanism that would allow me to withdraw the petition in exchange for a formal repayment agreement and title restructuring. There was. It required both parties to agree in writing, and it required a formal acknowledgement from Phillip and Isabel that the additional loans had been secured without my consent, which would create a legal record protecting me going forward. I called Phillip back. He answered on the first ring. I could hear that he'd been crying, or had been recently. Neither of us said anything for a moment. "I got your message," I said. "I didn't think you were listening." "I listened to all of them." Another silence. Then, "I'm sorry, Dad. Not sorry because we're losing the house. Sorry because I let her talk me into treating you like you were the problem. You weren't the problem. You weren't the problem." "No," I said, "I wasn't." We talked for 40 minutes. I laid out the terms. Phillip would need to acknowledge the unauthorized lending in writing, signed and notarized. Both of them would need to enter credit counseling, not optional, not suggested, a written condition of my withdrawing the petition. The home equity line would be consolidated into the primary mortgage through a refinancing that I would be consulted on at every step. And Isabel would need to be part of the conversation, the real conversation, not the one performed for my benefit. Phillip said he'd talk to her. I said he had 1 week. Isabel called me herself, 2 days later. It was the first time she'd ever called me directly in 5 years of marriage. Her voice was different than it was at the door in November. Not soft exactly, but without the careful management I was used to hearing. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I've known that for a while. I've been avoiding knowing it." "I appreciate that," I said. "The loans were my idea. I want to be clear about that. Phillip wanted to ask you first. I convinced him it wasn't necessary." A pause. "I was wrong." I let that sit for a moment. "We'll sign whatever you need us to sign," she said. "We want to stay in the house. But more than that, Phillip needs his father back. I think I've known that for longer than I've admitted." The legal withdrawal was filed in February. Mr. Feng drafted the repayment and restructuring agreement, a tight, specific document that gave me formal notification rights on any future major financial decisions related to the property for as long as my name remained on any associated documents. Philip and Isabel signed it at Mr. Feng's office on a Wednesday afternoon. I was there. We shook hands. Isabel met my eyes for the first time I could remember. The refinancing took another 6 weeks. The unauthorized loans were consolidated, the monthly payment structure reorganized, the home equity line frozen and being repaid on a 5-year schedule. Everything was documented. Everything was in writing. I went to their house for dinner in April. Philip made the chicken and wild rice. He'd apparently called my sister to get the recipe, and we sat at the kitchen table and didn't talk about any of it, which somehow said more than talking would have. I'm not telling you this story because it ended well. A lot of these stories don't. I'm telling you because I spent 31 years building things meant to hold up under pressure, and the most important thing I learned in all that time is that you have to know where your load-bearing elements are. In a bridge, it's the steel. In a family, it's honesty. And sometimes the only way to find out if the structure is still sound is to test it. Mine held, barely, but it held, and I made sure it was properly documented. There's a casserole dish sitting in my cupboard that I almost got rid of after that November afternoon. I couldn't look at it for weeks. Chicken and wild rice. The same dish I'd made for Philip every winter since he was a teenager. Left cooling on a stranger's porch railing while I walked back to my truck and made the hardest phone call of my life. Not hard because I didn't know what to do. Hard because I did know, and I did it anyway. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to act with integrity when the person you're protecting your integrity against is someone you love. It would have been easier to drive home and say nothing, to absorb the insult, tell myself it was Isabel's doing, and wait for things to improve on their own. A lot of people do that. They call it keeping the peace. What they're usually keeping is a slow accumulation of resentment that eventually collapses the whole structure anyway, just later with more damage. What stopped me from going quiet wasn't anger. It was something closer to self-respect. I'd spent 31 years applying my name to structures that had to hold. A bridge doesn't forgive you for ignoring a stress fracture. Neither does a mortgage document. When I signed that co-applicant agreement at TD Bank, I accepted legal responsibility. That responsibility didn't disappear because Philip had married someone who found me inconvenient. The intelligence part, and I don't mean book intelligence, I mean the kind of clear-eyed thinking that cuts through emotion to see what's actually happening. That was what kept me from making the situation worse. I didn't go back to yell. I didn't write letters. I gathered documentation. I called a lawyer who spoke in complete sentences. I let the legal process do what I couldn't do with words, which was make the consequences of bad decisions visible and unavoidable. You can dismiss a worried father. You cannot dismiss a court order. Then the hard part, the part nobody talks about, when Philip finally called and sounded like himself again. I had to decide whether the resolution I'd set in motion was truly about protecting my legal standing, or whether it was secretly about punishing him. I had to be honest with myself about that. If I'd kept the partition sale moving forward after that voicemail, after he said he knew he'd let his mother down, that wouldn't have been justice. That would have been cruelty dressed up as principle. The endurance piece is what carried me through the silence. Weeks of not answering. Playing his messages in an empty kitchen and choosing over and over not to reach back before the conditions were right. That kind of patience isn't passivity. It's the hardest kind of discipline there is. Holding a position not because you're unmoved, but because you understand that moving too soon will cost you everything you've held out for. The casserole dish is still in the cupboard. I used it again in April at Philip's kitchen table. He called my sister to get the recipe. That meant more to me than any signed document, though I was glad to have both. Some things, once broken, take a very long time to set properly. But they can set. You just have to know which repairs require patience and which require a structural engineer.